welcome to the Silvers Connection. I'm Ernie Silvers, your host. Today with me, special guest, Shannon Huffman Polson. Hi, Shannon, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Oh, we're so happy to have you. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Shannon. I don't want to spoil all of it because I've asked her to do her bio, so I'll give you some details. She is the youngest woman to climb Denali, which is the highest peak in North America. She also reached summits in Mount Rainier and Mount Kilimanjaro. So you were a climber in your early days, weren't you? My goodness. Also, perhaps the biggest and the most spectacular event is the first female to fly an Apache attack helicopter for the U.S. Army, leading platoons in Bosnia-Herzegovina. She earned her MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. She's been in corporate world. She's writing, has a current book that's just released called The Grit Factor. I can't recommend this book enough. It is a wonderful book. Did I leave anything out, Shannon? Tell us a little bit more about you and The Grit Factor.
Yeah, Ernie, thank you very much. It is really an honor to be here with you and with your incredible community. I did have the honor a number of years ago to be one of the first women to fly the Apache. I'm still waiting to find out the name and hear about who the very first one was, but I think I was number 9. And
yeah,
I spent a decade.
We're just going to say you're the first forever. Nobody will ever know, right?
I always want to make sure once I meet her, I want to give her the kudos. But yeah, I had a chance to lead 2 different flight platoons on 2 continents, and I commanded a company on a 3rd. And then I transitioned through that MBA and took that study of leadership and that passion for leadership into the corporate world as well. And then for the last 7 years, I have been keynoting and working with companies across industries, across the country and around the world on topics related primarily to leadership and grit. And it's really been an honor to have the chance to work with those companies, to understand what their requirements are and to find ways to help to solve some of their most challenging problems. But the most exciting recent development is, of course, that the Grit Factor was released in September of this year. And the Grit Factor, I know we're going to talk more about this, but it's been truly an honor to bring it into the world, in part because it's not just my own story, but it's the stories that I have collected over years of dozens of other leaders in the vanguards of their military fields. And they happen to be women, they happen to be military, and I'd love to talk more about them as we go forward. But it truly is an honor to bring it into the world. It's the book that I wish that I had had when I was a young leader, and even as a more mature leader that was facing challenge and facing change. It's a book that I would have been able to use then, and I have still found strength in even today.
It is an awesome story. There are amazing stories in the book, stories you have to read or hear to believe. I mean, they're just amazing stories. So tell us, Shannon, what is the Grit Factor? What exactly is the Grit Factor?
Well, that's what I started out to try to determine, because I thought back to my own experience when I had this young lieutenant reach out to me, and she was just getting ready to start flight school at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And she reached out through an online officer mentorship program and asked if I would be her mentor. And I immediately said yes. This was about 6 years ago. And then I thought, wow, it's been a while since I've worn the uniform. Surely my integration into an all-male field came with its own unique oddities that won't necessarily apply to her. And how can I scale the advice that I offer to her? And if I do that work, then scale the people to whom that advice is offered. Mm-hmm. And so that was really the genesis of what became the Grit Factor. And I, again, thought back to my own experience, thought about the word that I had always used when people said, well, geez, how did you do it? Like, how do you get through those really tough times? And I'd always said, well, you know, we always used the word grit growing up. Mm-hmm. So I started to interview these women, early women general officers, aviators from World War II to the present. So 3 generations, aviators flying everything in the inventory across the services. I interviewed one of the first women Army Rangers, a Navy submariner, a Coast Guard combat rescue swimmer, and so many more. And really looking for what is that thing that made them able to do what it is that they did, because they were all unique people. They weren't all, you know, the Ironman triathletes in high school. Anything like that. They were all unique individuals that led under extremely challenging conditions, mm-hmm. doing extremely challenging things. And what was it that made them able to do that I could share with others? So that's what the Grit Factor really went out to solve. And mm-hmm. at the end of the day, you know, I have defined grit as a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstance. And Angela Duckworth, who is, of course, the researcher at University of Pennsylvania, will call it passion and perseverance towards very long-term goals. But whichever way you describe it, what became really clear to me is that grit is not this discrete thing that you take off the shelf when you need it at mile 23 of the marathon and then you put it back, although you certainly need it there too. It's part of the fabric of our being, part of how it is that we're made up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what ended up informing how the grit factor was structured, how the training grit at the Grit Institute is structured as well. And that's in 3 different phases that look at all different parts of the whole leader.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Your book is broken down in 3 parts: commit, learn, and launch. Commit talks about know your core purpose. Can you talk about that a little bit? Knowing your core purpose.
Yeah, the commitment phase is really internal work. And I start there because I think it's very often the case that a leader will tend to, when he or she wants to excel in a given environment, say, okay, here's the mission and the vision of this company or this organization or whatever group it is that you're a part of. And I'm gonna attach myself to that and I'm gonna support that. But until a leader does deep internal work to both understand and own his or her own story and drill down to core purpose, you're not ready to make that commitment to anything else. And in fact, I don't think you really can in a way that's sustainable. So your question is specifically around core purpose. That's chapter 2, because I walk you through owning your own story, really taking that raw material of your life and deciding how it is that you're going to shape it. But then core purpose is going past why, right? We all have heard about starting with why. It's a great place to start, but it doesn't go nearly far enough.
Okay.
So I like to say that and I give an exercise to do this, that we have to drill down, and I recommend drilling down 5 layers, and I can walk through the exercise if you like, or we can just talk about going really, really deep into what ultimately is the foundation of who it is that we are and what drives us and what gives life meaning. And once we've connected to that, then we can weather the turbulence that is thrown at us no matter what comes.
Yeah, you have an interesting story from your own history about the 5 whys. Can you help us break it down and use your story to tell us that?
Yeah, sure. And of course, you're referring to the exercise that I give in the book. And what I did was to borrow the 5 whys from Toyota. And Toyota developed this 5 why program to drill down in manufacturing to the root cause of a deficiency. Mm-hmm. So that's excellent. I'm taking it into the human resources world and into our own leadership development to say,
right,
we want to ask ourselves why it is that we're doing something, right? And, and I remember back to showing up at Fort Bragg as a young lieutenant. I'd just been trained in the Apache helicopter. I was ready to fly. I was ready to be an aviation leader. I was charged up, ready to go. And I was put into a role in staff. So I was the assistant to the assistant operations officer, kind of a back office lackey. And it was not at all the role that I had hoped for. It wasn't the role that I thought I was coming into. I was really typing up, not even the operations orders themselves, but the appendices to the operations orders, usually starting around 6 o'clock at night when everyone else went home. So of course I did the best job that I could at the work that I was given, but then I went to the captain that I was working for. I said, sir, listen, I'm gonna keep doing the best job I can at what I've been given, but when's that flight platoon gonna open up? And that captain looked and said, Lieutenant, the Army doesn't owe you anything. So I went back to my work. I kept doing the best work that I could do. And then at some Saturday, a couple of weeks later, the major that all of us worked for called us into work on a Saturday. Now, I like to say that the Army doesn't have HR in quite the same way as most organizations, because there was no reason for us to be in there at all. Nothing we were for. We were just called into work on a Saturday. And I was working away at my desk, and he looked over and said, Lieutenant, don't worry, you'll be married by the time you're 25. Oh. Well, I didn't say anything back because I realized there was nothing that needed to be said to that, except that I went to see him that next week and said, sir, listen, I'm going to keep doing the best job I can at the work I've been given, but I think that I can do more. And he looked a little surprised, and then he gave me one additional duty after another. And one by one, I made sure that I hit them out of the park. And finally, I took that platoon. Now, I tell you that story for lots of reasons. One of them is that you should never be afraid to ask for what you want. Never assume that anybody knows what it is that you want. But number 2 is because in the midst of that year on staff, it was frustrating to be there. It was not where I thought that I wanted to be or where that I thought that I should be. I thought it was actually unfair, most likely. It would very easily have been a situation where I could have become so discouraged that I just sort of gave up and accepted somebody else's narrative. And so I like to give this example as a perfect place to ask the 5 whys. Why was I there? Well, I was there to fly the Apache helicopter, to be an aviation leader. All right, that's fine. But I wasn't really doing as much of that as I had expected. And I didn't really have a lot of control over how the shop was run. or what my boss was going to assign me to do.
Right.
So why was I there to be an Apache pilot and an aviation leader? Because I was trained to do that. Why? Because I'd asked for it and I had earned that opportunity. Why? Because I wanted to serve my country. That's pretty good, right?
Yep.
Why? I wanted to serve. So really drilling down to that fifth layer gives me that core purpose that's not necessarily associated with the Army or with that operation shop, but is part of who I am. And once I could connect to that, gosh, you can get through anything. When you say, I'm here to serve, right now, I'm here to serve. Am I frustrated with any of these other layers? Yeah, sure, maybe. But I'm connected to this foundation that is absolutely integral to being able to access and to be able to grow in grit and resilience and to be able to push through this and to be able to get to the next thing.
Yeah. So oftentimes we are assigned crappy jobs, so to speak, that we didn't really want to do. We didn't sign up for this, not realizing that you got to start someplace. And you have to be strong enough to work through it and not lose focus to get where you want to go. Right.
That's right. And you've got to do an excellent job, right? It doesn't matter. My grandpa used to tell me when we were little, and he came from Kansas. So this is where this comes from. He said, if you get paid 25 cents an hour to clean toilets, you better earn every single penny of that 25 cents and do the best job anyone's ever seen. And I really believe that, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what the job is. You've got to do your absolute best work. You've got to exceed expectations. And then it's very difficult for anybody to argue when you go back and say, hey, I think I'm ready for that next position. When's that going to be available? And, let's put that on the calendar.
Yeah, you attract attention from others by being excellent at what you do and the attitude that you portray and not being bogged down in all the minutia. And because it's easy to adopt a bad attitude, but nobody cares for that.
Exactly.
But
well, most people adopt a bad attitude, and that's what will distinguish you specifically is if you don't. If you make the conscious decision, because it is a conscious decision to decide I'm going to be excellent no matter what this job is, I'm going to show myself to exceed the standard, to take care of the team members around me, and you will distinguish yourself because most people don't do that.
That's
but you
true.
have the opportunity to really be exceptional just by making those decisions.
So it's a mental choice, isn't it? Because it's easy to focus on the negative, but it's something different to focus on the positive and make the best that you possibly can. Now you talk about a concept.
It's absolutely.
You talk about a concept in the book, and I love this concept, and I want to hear your viewpoint on it. It's called learned helplessness. Learned helplessness. What is that?
I think it's this, and I think it's very easy to do this, by the way, to allow your children to do this, but I think that you see adults doing this as well, where they just say that, oh, I can't do this because, right? I can't do this because, there's COVID or it's just too hard, or I'm working and so I can't possibly go to school. And there is this, anytime that's supported, I think people continue to learn that is somehow okay. And that will take you down a road that gets you nowhere. I mean, and that's what a lot of people do, unfortunately. I really believe that you have the opportunity and the responsibility every single day to commit to excellence. And when you do that, you commit to that positive outlook, you commit to that positive and excellent work. That learned helplessness will be something that's for other people and not for you. So again, challenging yourself to do that work and to do it well is the critical piece.
So we're back to the mindset and the choice. You have a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
absolutely.
Building resilience, beating fear. I notice I do a lot of career coaching with folks and notice that fear is a big problem, right? And we already fight that lizard brain fight flight mentality of being afraid to do anything but fall down in the fetal position in a dark room and close the shades. We don't want to do anything. How is building resilience part of the grit factor?
It's something that I get asked in almost every presentation I do, which is, do you just have grit or you don't? Because it seems like that person over there has it and I don't feel like I do. Ooh. And the reality is that the science is pretty clear that number one, it's accessible to all of us, right? It's something that all of us have inside of us. And I like to think of it as that intersection between your core purpose and your passion. But not only that, I think all of us have experienced times when we don't feel connected to that grit. We don't feel connected to the place where we're able to be resilient. Mm-hmm. And those are practiced, learned behaviors as well. It's like a muscle, right? It's like a muscle that You learn to do hard things by doing hard things. Now, ideally, you do incrementally harder things. You don't just go out and run 26 miles, right? When you're training for a marathon, you start out with smaller distances and you look at training plans and there's ways that you go about it, but you do hard things and you get better at doing hard things by doing hard things. And part of that is mindset. Part of that's the mindset and the understanding that that's actually, in fact, how your brain works. Carol Dweck has done this growth mindset research at Stanford, and they've been very, very clear in the data that when you teach children how their brains are developing when they work hard, they're willing to work harder. They're less afraid of failure because they see them, they understand the benefit as they go into the challenge, right? And otherwise they might immediately kind of freeze up because they don't think they can make it. But
Right.
when you build those muscles of grit and resilience, it absolutely affects your ability to face that fear that all of us feel fear. But there's both the building up the grit and resilience piece. There's the mindset that I'm going to move forward no matter what. And there's also understanding that fear is not final, right? That it's not fear or failure that even matters. That's part of the road to success.
Right.
All of us are going to fall down. But it's what you do with that fear or that failure that matters. It's the fact that you get up afterwards and you redirect course and say, what am I going to try next?
Right.
And not being afraid to try something, fail, adjust course, and then try again.
Right. Right. I tell folks that the reason you fear failure is because you don't do it often enough. You need to fail more often and realize that it's not fatal. Failure isn't failure. It's an event. It's not a person, right? And not to identify with that. Let's talk about the learning part. Part 2, learning. You talk about your circle. You talk about listening. Listening is something that we all have to practice and we don't do very well. Talk about learning in your book.
Yeah, so the 3 phases, and again, these 3 phases broke out very much because of doing the synthesis of these dozens of interviews of leaders in the vanguards of their field. So these are the things that break out as showing up again and again in all of these very different leaders' journeys, doing very different things, all very challenging, in challenging environments, often in places where people didn't want them to be there. So they really face what I like to think of as a double crucible, which means that what they have to teach you, whether you're a man or a woman, about leadership and grit is extremely relevant.
Right.
And so the commit phase is that internal work. We just talked about that.
Right.
The learn phase is really connected with deep engagement in the present. And then launch is a future outlook with that engagement in the present and that grounding in the past. So I like to think of that as the grit triad. But this learn phase really is, again, deep engagement in the present. And you'll notice that the 2 of the 3 pieces of that learn phase are about relationships. They're about people. And that's because the way that you get things done and the way that you work effectively is with people. And that means that we have to understand what relationships are necessary to help support us in our journeys.
Yeah. We
We also need to be part of other people's circles to support them in their journeys. And there's a reciprocal strength that comes from that. And the second part is that listening. And I was, when I was asked recently, what's the most surprising thing that came out of the research for the Grit Factor? I was like, I didn't expect there to be a whole chapter on listening, but this came out of every conversation with a general officer, that the most strategic listening skill or leadership skill is this ability, and it's an art and a science of active listening. And again, to your point, not very many of us do it very well.
What exactly is active listening as a part of the Grit Factor? And I want you to go through it on purpose because we're so bad at doing it. So help us understand.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite things in this chapter is actually looking at the Chinese character to listen. And I think it's so fascinating because, Chinese characters are made up of many different characters. Any one character has many other characters as a part of it. And I'll actually just sort of hold this up for those of who are looking at YouTube, but you can find this on page 105 of the book. But it shows in this character, it shows ears. So that's what you would expect, right, for active listening. It shows eyes, which means we're connecting directly to that other person, right? There's a line that indicates mind or undivided attention and focus. And then there's a bottom piece of it that's the heart. And that's really that personal connection. And, I think back actually to a job that after my business degree, and the regional manager of the medical device company where I was working, and going in to talk to her, I only got to see her once a quarter. So she's my boss. I only get to see her once a quarter. And literally, I don't think she looked at me once. She was on her it was a BlackBerry at the time. She was on her BlackBerry the entire 30-minute meeting, the only 30 minutes I had in the 3-month period to connect with my supervisor. And that's an example of not active listening. But when we look at active listening, I think understanding that all of these parts of our mind and our body are part of what an active listener needs to engage helps to put it in perspective. We can't be checking our phones or checking, Twitter on the computer while we're talking to somebody. We have to really be listening. And I think the thing that I had found to be most interesting, and I did this as an exercise actually at my business school at Tuck, was an exercise where you ask a question to somebody and then you pause and allow them to answer. And then there's just a pause. You give an uncomfortable pause. Because most of us who are very action-oriented, very execution-oriented, tend to be listening with the intent to reply. I am guilty of this myself all of the time. And if you're listening with the intent to reply, you're actually listening. You're not actually taking in what that person is saying or conveying, and they will have that sense. And so they won't also be able to honestly convey whatever it is that they need to share with you. But if you leave that pause, that space to really take in what it is that you're hearing, and then think about how it is that you might respond to that. It's a really tough exercise, and it's so important. If the conversation's important enough, there's actually an example that Brene Brown gives in one of her books that I actually quote in The Grit Factor, where she says, you know what? I don't think I can answer that right now. Why don't we take a couple of days and come back together and let me think about that? And what a smart thing to do, right? Take a couple of days and really digest this really difficult feedback that you just got, or this really complicated and difficult idea that you weren't ready to receive. If you're not ready to receive it, it's okay. Receive it. And then take that pause, whatever that needs to be, whether it's 30 seconds or whether it's 3 days.
3 days.
And then you're able to really have that connection in a meaningful way. And I think there's so much potential in that.
Yeah, it allows the brain to figure it out. We discount the most powerful computer between our ears, and the brain will work on the problem if you allow it to. But you're right. We oftentimes listen to people just to catch on one little nugget, and then I have something to say which has nothing to do with what you just said. So we're constantly working on that. That is such a, Why do you think it's such a problem for most people to do? Is it the patience aspect? Is it the coordinating all of the ears and the eyes and the heart? Or we need some more glue or something? I don't know what's gonna.
We don't practice it very often, for one, right? Most of us haven't been trained in it. If we have had any training in it, we haven't practiced it. We don't practice it regularly, even if we've practiced it once. Right. Many of us are overloaded with requirements and we're just trying to move on to the next thing, right? And so that is, I think, that action, that orientation towards action and towards execution. And so that makes us tend to be less likely to listen. Yeah. Or to really listen actively. And one of the reasons, Ernie, this is so important, and when we talk about, for those companies and those organizations, and this should be all of them, that are really interested in diversity and inclusion, this is what brings you from diversity to inclusion, because diversity is not enough, right? Just having the people at the table is not enough. Having people at the table is the first step, but allowing people with different ideas and different backgrounds and different perspectives to truly share insights is what makes organizations stronger. It makes them more resilient, and it increases the bottom line. So that's how you move from diversity to inclusion, is really being able to institute a culture of respect, of trust, and that includes this skill, this art, and this science of active listening.
So bringing people to the table, allowing them to participate, and then using the ideas, right? And you're right. It takes patience. It takes time. You have to want, I think you have to want to do it. Again, we're back to that mental thing. You have to want to do it. It's a mindset. You have to make a choice. That is awesome. All right. Something else that's fascinating to me, because I love this part. During the launch section, you write a piece about having the audacity to be yourself. Having the audacity to be yourself. Folks have so much trouble with that. One, because they don't know who they are. So how could I be me if I don't know who I am? So Shannon, help us, rescue us. How do we have the audacity to be ourselves?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. And, you know, this is one of those examples of where I write from a point of failure, because I've had people ask after presentations, well, how were you able to truly be yourself while you were in this all male field in the Army? And I said, well, I didn't do it very well. And that's why I can write about it. And I think it's interesting to talk to the other leaders that I interviewed for the Grit Factor. Some of them were able to do it, some of them were not. But I think we all learn as we mature how important it is for sustainable leadership. And so I would say the first place you start is by doing that internal work of the commit phase. And that is really spending time. This is not a 5-minute exercise. I mean, you could knock it out in 5 minutes, but really spending time with understanding and owning your own story is the first part of knowing who you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doing that work to drill down into core purpose and core values, that's part of doing the work of who you are. And then when you get to the place where you start to understand more who you are, and you take any decision that you make in any way that you respond, and you hold those up against your values and up against your core purpose, that's how you try to make sure that you remain authentic to who it is that you are acting within a given environment. That can still be really difficult. And it's difficult, especially for minorities in majority environments, right? If you're not in the majority, there is a natural tendency, and there is actually something of a requirement to some degree, to fit into the culture of a place, or to fit into the norms of the place. And if you're in the minority, if you're a woman in an all-male environment, if you're another kind of minority in another kind of majority environment, if that compromises who you are at your core, if that compromises your core values, that's not authentic to who you are. It's not sustainable, and it can actually be quite damaging. And so I think that's where it's so important to do that work, to define those values, define that core purpose, and to really make sure that you're holding up whatever it is that you do against that list of requirements of who it is that you are. And that is hard work. I mean, it's just very hard work. There's always going to be some requirement to fit into a culture. You have to make sure that you're joining a culture that feels like it is in concert with the values that you hold.
Right.
But then make sure that even within the context of that culture, that you're making decisions that are also consistent with your own personal core values and your own personal core purpose.
Yeah, not compromising who you are. Yeah, you can't.
Exactly.
There's only one you, right? And you can't give up on you. You have to be comfortable in your own skin, right? And it's challenging.
Exactly.
You're right, balancing that, trying to fit in and trying to, get along and so forth, yet not compromising who you are, because each of us as individuals add value, right? If we allow ourselves, bless you, if we allow ourselves to participate at a level that's us. So
that's exactly right.
So again, that's
honestly, that's both respecting your own place in this whole inclusion piece. Mm-hmm. And as a manager, it's respecting others' place as well. And knowing that they cannot bring, and you cannot bring your full self to the table. You can't make your best contributions if you're not fully yourself. And that you have contributions to make if you are authentic to who you are, that will not be available to you if you try to be someone else. And so some of that comes with maturity, but I think that some of that can really be worked on no matter how young you are, by doing some of that internal work up front.
Right. So it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not a one and done. You have to work on it. How did you come to the place where you recognized this, working through? Because most awesome stories come out of diversity. Hey, this happened, it was tragic, but here's what I learned, and this is how I grew. What was it that caused you to finally understand you needed to be your true self?
I think that it's an iterative process, or at least it is for me. I've never once been struck by lightning and suddenly been enlightened. So I always feel like it might be just a hard head, but it's always, I've always wished for that, but it's never quite happened that way. But I would say towards the end of my time in the military, I had stayed very operationally focused. I was good at it, but it wasn't my passion in the long run. And I think that I started to understand that there were parts of me, and specifically more creative aspects of myself, that I was not able to bring to the table, that I wasn't able to invest in, and that it was not going to be a healthy place for me to stay for a number of reasons, but that being among those. I went on to business school and then was working in the business world. I love business. I love operations. I love leadership.
Mhm.
But I needed to be able to pull a more creative piece into what it was that I was doing, not just spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations, but really getting more into the heart of
Yeah.
what it was that I was working on. And so, I think, Ernie, that my very first book is called North of Hope, and it's a much more story. It's a memoir. There's a lot of grit in it as well. It's about a trip up in northeastern Alaska in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where my father was with his wife on their 16th anniversary, my stepmother, and they were killed by a grizzly bear while they were kayaking the Hula Hula River. And I was 33 years old when this happened. And I went up the next year and basically followed their footsteps. I took the same trip and, landed in this airplane in the same place, flew out in a small airplane to the same starting place, got in a boat and went down the same river. And I think that was part of learning as well, that life is short and there's not enough time to not be yourself, right? There's not enough time to try to do something to meet somebody else's ideas of what success looks like.
Yeah.
And that's where I started to realize, I think, that I really needed to be able to honor these other pieces of myself that I had not been honoring as much. And so I did spend several more years at Microsoft after that point, but then I left Microsoft to write that first book. And then to start this work that I'm doing now, which is speaking and writing and working with people to really be able to bring out the best in themselves and in their teams and in their organizations. And it's work that I love, but it's taken me a long time to get here. Part of it is that when you run into tragedy, you I think sometimes get a bit of a jolt, not quite the lightning bolt that illuminates everything, but at least a jolt that says, hey, what's important? I don't have time in my life for what's not important anymore.
Yeah.
I just need to focus on what really matters. And so there's a gift in some of that as well, and you have to focus on those gifts.
Yeah, and you're right. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a 10-year overnight success. You have to keep working.
10 or 20. Yeah, exactly.
10 or 20. Just don't do the 20. All right, I want to talk about optimism, because you talk about in the section about build your resilience. You talk about optimism. And you talk about the Stockdale paradox, and I want you to talk about that a little bit. But maintaining hope, being optimistic, especially now with the COVID thing going on, and people are starting to lose it a little bit. And you have to look, we're going to get through this. It's going to end eventually. It's going to be okay. No, really, I mean it. Talk about maintaining optimism.
Yeah, this is a really important thing. And I will give the brief anecdote about the Stockdale paradox in case anybody's not familiar with it. But Admiral Stockdale was a pilot in Vietnam. He was shot down flying right over the treetops, captured almost immediately, imprisoned in the Hanoi Hilton. And because he was the ranking naval officer, he was in solitary confinement for about half of the 7.5 years that he was in prison, 7.5 years. He had his legs broken 3 times. He was tortured mercilessly. And when the war ended and he was finally released, they asked him, what is the difference between those who lived and those who died? And he said, well, that's easy. It was the optimists who died. And now that seems like a paradox. This is the Stockdale paradox. He said, well, the optimists were the ones that said, surely this will be over in just a couple of months, or the war will be done by the end of the summer, and then they'll release us. And those dates came and went, and nothing changed. And really, they died of broken hearts. And he said, you have to never, ever confuse the ultimate faith in the end, which you cannot ever afford to lose, faith in the end. We will get through this. You can't ever confuse that with confronting the brutal realities of what you are facing. And so I think that's really, really an important thing. I like to think of my grit triad, this past, present, and future, commit, learn, and launch, is surrounded by the mindset of grounded optimism, not optimism, but grounded optimism. And I just actually thought of this as you were asking the question, that my husband and I have talked about sailing at various points. And the reality is I get a little seasick. And so I might sail on calm waters, but that's really going to be it. But when you are seasick, you look at the horizon. If you're right in the midst of the boat, if you're in the midst of what's going on, this is the same in the air. I should give that example more for the flying metaphor, right?
And you would know about that.
I can tell I can tell. And actually, I do get airsick. And I remember.
No, stop. You're killing me. Don't say that.
but not when I'm flying. And that's the difference. So and that's actually probably a great metaphor too. I'm going to start to use this one. But I remember when we were in Bosnia, we were doing our orientation flights. And those of us who were about to take over from the unit that was leaving had our maps open, and the backseater would fly and I would be in the front seat with my maps open, and I'm following the lines of communication, the roads, and I'm looking at the terrain. And I started to get really airsick. And I was like, oh, geez, this isn't going to work. And I said, hey, I need to fly. And you just narrate to me what I'm seeing. And I'll remember that. And I'll take that back and apply that to the maps. Because once you take the controls, once you're flying, once you're making decisions in the present, looking at that horizon, right? You look at that horizon and then you feel fine. And I think that is that grounded optimism that Stockdale talks about. You've got to look at the far horizon. And that doesn't necessarily mean, when people say, oh gosh, conferences are coming back next winter, January, it's just around the corner. I don't think so. I mean, I don't think the science thinks so.
Yes,
so
you broke my heart earlier when I asked you that. You broke my heart. I said,
What's that now?
I said, you broke my heart earlier when I asked you think we'll be back? And you said, oh no, I don't think it's going to be that way at all. So.
Yeah, but you know what? If it is, then great. But
Yay.
If it isn't, you have broken your heart. And so I think there's some reality there in saying, let's just be a little realistic about this. We don't know the outcome. The horizons are unclear. That's what's so hard right now is we can't look forward to next September and know with certainty that what's going to have changed. But we can operate within the context of our day-to-day. Yes. What I like to tell people right now is you find small wins every week, every single week. Find a small win, celebrate that small win every single week, and do that with your team, do that with your family, do that with yourself, and then look at about 3 years. It seems pretty realistic that in 3 years, we probably will have been traveling for a while, don't worry. But let's just say in 3 years, our family wants to take a vacation and we want to go to California. You're in California, but I'm in Washington. So I'll say my family wants to go to California. So then you start to plan, you start to read about it, you start to look forward and anticipate to something in the future. So having those near-term successes and that long-term anticipation is a really good recipe for staying grounded in this grounded optimism. And that's what I would recommend to anybody right now, because that's what we really need.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just make sure I get this straight now. Grounded optimism is maintaining an optimism that we will survive this, we'll get through it, but don't set unrealistic deadlines for when it's all going to be fixed, because that's not realistic, right?
Well, you don't have control over that. You have to look within your sphere of control, right? And you've got to really operate within that sphere of control for right now. You can have dreams for 3 years out, but for right now, look at those elements that you can control and work on just controlling those elements. So that's all you've got.
Stay focused.
It's empowering.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It really truly is empowering if you can do that. So I think that's a great opportunity for folks. It gives yourself and gives your team agency. And we all need a little bit of agency right now. And I think people are feeling a little out of control. And if you know that you have agency, even over this small piece, that's really powerful.
Okay. Now, what do you mean by have agency? You're losing me here. Help me.
Well, having agency meaning that you have control, right?
Okay.
So there's some small thing that you have control over. And I have given this example a couple of times when people say, well, how do you talk to teams about going back to work? I said, the best example I've heard about a team, or it's actually a whole company going back to work, is the leadership said to their people, come up with a plan that you are comfortable with and come back to us and present it to us. The companies that are coming down from the top and saying, all right, we want 30% of the people back in the office as of October 1st, that makes people pretty, because some people aren't ready to come back in, and some people might not be ready to come back in for some time for any host of reasons. But when you give people the agency or the power to make their own decisions, that's an important thing for us all to have some aspect of right now. And I think that's an opportunity that teams and organizations have to give their people.
Yeah. Yeah. So control what you can control and do it. Stay focused. Do it one day at a time. Keep your eyes on the horizon, as Shannon says. Let's keep your eyes on the horizon. Parting shots. What is your quick bit of wisdom for those coming out of college, universities, going into the post-COVID environment? What thoughts would you have on that?
Well, I just read a piece the other day about the importance of lifelong learning. So coming out of college, coming out of even graduate school, doesn't mean that's the last that you're going to learn, right? You're going to keep learning your whole life. And the people that will be most successful in this world that continues to change and evolve so rapidly are those who continue to learn and have a passion for learning. So I think that's number one. You're not done, you're just continuing the process. And that's exciting, by the way. I talked to a group of young women engineers from Duke and a couple of them were really, really worried. They said, we're going to graduate and we're going to get a job and then we're just going to do that for 50 years. And I was like, no, that's not how it works.
It's not how it works.
No. So the advice I give to young people who are just getting started, because there is a tendency also to kind of hop around a bit, right? To stay somewhere a really short time and then go somewhere else for a short time. I would say go somewhere where you can contribute meaningfully and where you can learn something significant, and don't leave until you've done both of those things. Mm-hmm. And then if you decide that it's time to move on for some other reason, well, that's fine. Then go somewhere else and stay as long as you need to learn something significant and to contribute meaningfully. So don't leave until you've done those two things. You're going to keep on learning. I think that's really, really important. And then the last thing, and this is something that somebody recommended to me as I was finishing my MBA program, and it was excellent advice, is that the job that you're doing doesn't matter nearly so much as the person that you're working for. Because if you work for somebody who is going to support you and your career, who's going to develop you, who's going to give you opportunities, who's going to either mentor you or find another person who might be a good mentor or support to help you develop that circle that we talk about in the learn phase of the grit factor, that person will be much more valuable to you than any specifics of a job. So don't worry about the job itself so much as you worry about the person that you're looking for. And at the same time, don't despair if you're not looking for the perfect person right away. Just look for those people and make sure that you're constantly connecting yourself to the places and the people where you can learn best and where you're most supported. So I think those are some really great opportunities. And just know the world, it's a wide, wide world with so many opportunities. And even though things are tricky right now, that also means that there's opportunities to be creative in ways that people were not able to be probably even just a year ago. So that's embrace that and go out there and find the way. It's not going to be the old way. You're going to find the new way.
Yeah, focus on the opportunity. Don't look at the problems. All right.
Absolutely.
All right.
And there's huge opportunity. Huge opportunity.
There are.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap it for today. Thank you so much. The book, The Grit Factor, available at Amazon and wherever you find your books. If folks want to get in touch with you, I believe you have a website. What is that website?
Yeah, my website is Shannon Polson, Polson.com, or thegritinstitute.com, that has training that is very strongly connected to the book. I can also develop tailored training programs for organizations or deliver online keynotes, so virtual or eventually back in person. And the only other thing I would ask is if you read The Grit Factor and you love it, please do leave a review at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's a great way to let other people find the book as well.
That's right. That's right. Leave an awesome, awesome review for an awesome, awesome book. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for being our guest today. This is going to be it for today. Find us online at mba.csusb.edu. Drop me an email at mba@csusb.edu. Thanks for visiting with us today. Stop by again and see us. Shannon, thank you. Have a great, great day. That's it for now from the Silvers Connection.